Chapter 14 The Era of the Judges of Israel. This week, our winding path through history brings us back to the children of Israel. When we left their story several weeks ago, they had just entered the Promised Land, the land that God had promised Abraham so many years ago. The time period of their deliverance from Egypt and their wandering in the wilderness is a fascinating and often confusing topic. There are still many questions about the exact date, and the chronologists who study these matters have used different sources and evidence for calculating the years these events occurred and which pharaoh is mentioned in the Bible. Noted scholar James Ussher places the Exodus at 1491 BC and the period in the wilderness as lasting until 1451 BC. As we know from our studies of the people who lived in Canaan during this time, the land was certainly not empty. The Israelites had to fight for it, but God delivered each city and group of people into their hands when they listened to him and obeyed. The Israelites lived in their promised land for many years. They farmed the land. They were so very happy to be there. And Joshua, now a very old man, was still considered their honored leader. Joshua lived to be 110 years old, and before he died, he called the people together one last time. Read this account of Joshua's last words with the people in Joshua 23 through 24. You would think that after all God had done for them, the Israelites would be so careful to follow God's instructions in every way. But just like us, they messed up. After Joshua's death, they turned their backs on God and they worshipped the idols of the Canaanites. They also married Canaanite women, which angered God, and he allowed them to be conquered and ruled by the king of Mesopotamia. The Israelites lived under the reign of this king for 8 long years. Oh, how they wished they had listened and obeyed God. They finally turned back to God and cried out for help. God sent them a warrior named Othniel, who was the nephew of Caleb. It was Caleb who had stood with Joshua in believing that God could deliver the city of Jericho into their hands. And now it was Othniel who stood up to fight the king of Mesopotamia. God used this brave man to defeat the enemy and, once again, free his people. He ruled Israel as a judge for 40 years, and during this time, there was peace and prosperity in Israel. After his death, Israel once again drifted into rebellion. They wanted to be like neighbors. They wanted to be like their neighbors, who all had gods that could be seen and touched. Never mind that these gods were created by human hands out of wood, ivory, or rock. Never mind that they were powerless to help or that they were worthless pieces of junk. No, the Israelites were not satisfied with their God, who had delivered them from the hand of the most powerful king on the face of the earth. They had a very short attention span and an even shorter memory of the trouble that they got into every time they turned their backs on God. Again, God allowed foreign kings to attack and conquer Israel. This time, it was the king of Moab who attacked, and with the help of other enemies of Israel, he became the new ruler of Israel. God had withdrawn his hand of protection from his people, but he was still there. He still watched over them and waited for them to repent. For 18 long years, the Israelites were oppressed by the Moabites, and again they grew weary of being without the protection of God. They decided to return to him and beg for his forgiveness. It completely amazes me how patient our God is. He is so loving and kind, even when we do not deserve it. Once again, he sent someone to deliver the Israelites from the hands of their enemies. This time, the chosen leader's name was Ehud. After they had broken free from the Moabites, they lived in peace. Judges 3:30 says the Israelites had rest for 80 years. The next judge to rule Israel was Shamgar, who helped defeat the Philistines. Shamgar was followed by a mighty woman of God named Deborah. Israel was once again slipping into familiar rebellion and disobedience when Deborah took a stand. She had the gift of prophecy, and God told her many things that would happen if the Israelites did not obey. Deborah led the people of Israel against the cruel oppressors who were making life miserable for the Israelites. Deborah and a man of God named Barak, who was a brave soldier, led the people in obedience to God. They were considered judges of Israel and honored by all people. For 40 years, Deborah and Barak led the children of Israel, and there was peace once again in the land. Of course, as you might suspect now, the Israelites wandered away from God again after Deborah and Barak were gone. They returned to their idols and worshipped worthless gods again. This time, there was a group of people called the Midianites, who were eyeing the land of Israel. God withdrew his hand of protection from his wayward, disobedient children and allowed the Midianites to move in on them. They literally moved into the land, and like a swarm of grasshoppers, they ate up and consumed everything the Israelites had. Their crops and homes were destroyed by these pesky neighbors. When they had been overrun with the Midianites once again, the children of Israel came to their senses and cried out to the Lord for help. As usual, God had a special person chosen to help his people. Gideon was not from a rich family. He was not the oldest of his brothers. He did not have strength to drive out swarms of pesky Midianites who were plaguing the people. What Gideon did have was a powerful God in whom he believed and trusted. God knew he could trust Gideon to carry out his orders, and he delivered the Israelites from the Midianites. Gideon was a judge for 40 years, and he was followed by Tola, Jar, Jephthah, Ibez, Elon, Eli, and Samuel. This last judge of Israel, Samuel, was a highly respected man of God, and we will learn more about him in our next chapter. Throughout the time of the judges, Israel drifted back and forth between obedience and rebellion. During the time of the judges, there was a godly Hebrew named Elimelech, who lived in the land of Judah with his wife Naomi and his 2 small sons. There came to Judah a harsh famine, so Elimelech moved his family to a nearby land of Moab. This land had plenty of food, but the life there was difficult adjustment for them. Their Moabite neighbors all worshipped false gods and had never heard of the one true God. Elimelech and Naomi stood firm in their faith in God, and they taught their sons to worship him too. Then the family suffered a terrible shock. Elimelech died. Now Naomi had no one but her sons. Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, took care of their mother until they were grown. When they were old enough, they both married young ladies from Moab, Ruth and Orpah. Ruth became a follower of God also, and she loved her mother-in-law very much. Their happiness was not to last long, however, for once again tragedy struck the family. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, leaving Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah alone and without protection. Word reached Naomi that the famine was over in Judah, so she decided to return to her homeland. Both of her daughters-in-law wanted to travel back with her, and she agreed to let them come part of the way. When they had traveled a short distance, Naomi told them to return to their families and remarry. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye and returned to the land of Moab. But Ruth absolutely refused. She hugged Naomi close and declared resolutely, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I go. Wherever you live, I live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Naomi knew Ruth wanted to stay with her and take care of her, and with lighter steps, the 2 women continued their journey to Bethlehem. When the women reached their destination, Naomi's friends were overjoyed to see her. They were shocked, however, at the change they saw in their friend's face. The grief and sorrow she had suffered had etched deep lines in her once smooth face. Naomi told her gathered friends to call her Mara, which means bitter and sorrowful. Because God had taken away everything she once had, she no longer wanted to be named Naomi, which means pleasant. It was harvest time in Israel at the time of Naomi's return. The fields were full of ripe grain, and the harvesters were reaping. In ancient Israel, there was a custom that helped the poor among them. As the reapers went through binding up their bundles of grain, they left some of the harvest for the poor to gather. When Ruth heard about this practice, she begged Naomi to allow her to gather this grain. Naomi knew that the field Ruth wanted to glean belonged to one of her rich relatives. This relative was a godly man named Boaz, and he was considered her husband's close kin. When Boaz saw Ruth gleaning in his field, he asked his workmen who she was. And when they answered that she was a Moabite who had returned with her mother-in-law Naomi, Boaz commanded them to leave plenty of grain for her to glean. He then told Ruth not to glean from any other field and to refresh herself from her maidservant's water jars. Boaz watched as Ruth diligently worked to gather food for Naomi and herself. She did not flirt with the workers, and she was modest and quiet. Boaz admired her and decided to ask for permission to marry her. There was one other relative who was closer than he. Boaz went to this man and asked him if Boaz could take his place as the kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer is a male relative who now marries a widow and redeems the family line by giving her a child to carry on the name. He also buys the family's land, which is being forfeited, therefore redeeming the family fortune as well as the legacy. Boaz acquired permission to marry Ruth and take care of Naomi. Ruth married Boaz, and together they had a little boy. The little boy was named Obed. Obed grew up to have a son named Jesse, and Jesse became the father of David. Ruth, the Moabite woman who came to believe in the one true God, became the grandmother of the great King David and the matron of the lineage of Jesus, our Savior. This story thrills me to my fingertips, and I am chuckling as I write it because God amazes me with his absolutely perfect plans. He had promised Abraham that he would make his family a great nation, a nation from which he could bring the Messiah. God can redeem every situation, every sorrowful soul, every broken heart. He sent Boaz to be Ruth's kinsman redeemer, and he used him to be a symbol of what Jesus would be for all the rest of us. Redeemer. Before we finish this section of our story, I want to let you in on a little background information about Boaz. Do you see who the mother of Boaz is? Rahab. Did you remember that when we read the scriptures about how Moses had sent spies into Canaan to look around? Do you remember that woman Rahab in Jericho? Do you see how God uses Boaz's marriage to Ruth as a redemption to his own family line? The God of the universe, the Ancient of Days, knows all our stories. He is in the process of weaving an intricately beautiful tapestry that we call history.